And I'm going to focus on the Lewis and Clark expedition. One of the principal figures in that expedition was their interpreter, a 15-year-old Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. The U.S. Mint produced a coin with Sacagawea's image, which is on one of your order of service back in 2000. This is a imaginative recreation of Sacagawea by a poet who is not an Indian, but is a friend of mine, Erica Funkhauser. It's called Bird Woman. Bird Woman is one of the translations of Sacagawea's name. And this is the last two sections of that poem. The poem takes her through the whole trip of Lewis and Clark, but this takes her at the westwardmost end of that journey at Fort Clatsop in Oregon and the Pacific Ocean. Fort Clatsop on the Columbia River, Christmas 1805. We have built a circle of cabins. Oh, I should also remind you that Sacagawea's husband was Toussaint Charbonneau, and her little baby that she carried with her, she named it Baptiste. But she had the nickname Janie from William Clark, called her Janie. Fort Clatsop on the Columbia River, Christmas 1805. We have built a circle of cabins where we await the warm weather in which it is safe to start east. It rains every day. The fleas keep us busy. Still, we are planning a ceremony with cannon fire and the exchange of small gifts. I have prepared many tales of White Weasel for my friend William Clark, who has offered to send Baptiste to school when we return to Fort Mandan. My son will never go to white school, I tell William, but you have given his mother another gift she will pass on to the boy. When we were starving on Cape Disappointment, and you gathered the men together to decide where we should camp for the winter, you asked Sacagawea to speak her mind as well. When she argued in favor of a place with plenty of potatoes, you heard what she said. You recorded her vote along with the others, the votes of the hunters and boatmen, the French engagés and the black man, Ben York. You wrote the word, Janie, in your red leather journal. Named like a wren's warm whistle, name spoken only by you. On the beach near Tillamook, January 1806. Some of the salt makers came home to the fort talking about the big fish on the beach. Many men wanted to see it. So did I. I told William, I have traveled a long way to see the great waters, to stand at their edge. I will take it very hard if you keep me from seeing this. Like the pounding tail of a grouse, my words drummed the ground, a new Sacagawea. By the time we got to the place where the waves had swept the big visitor ashore, no meat was left. Not one bite of flesh or of blubber, none of the delicate oil. Clark's anger was more white than the rafters of the whalebone. For once I was not hungry, not in a hurry to get anywhere. The sun that had been hiding for so long played among the pebbles. I let Baptiste wade in the yellow foam, put his nose in the water so he would never forget its stink. Then I lay down in the sand beside the sea creature and saw I could do so 20 times more and still not reach the end of its tail. I invited myself into its belly. To stand inside another animal when you are neither dead nor waiting to be born. I took the hands of Baptiste and showed him a dance. He moved with the sun on his shoulders. I left him with Charbonneau, who was making a big talk to the pretty Tillamook guide. I said goodbye for a while and walked to the edge of the water. There was no thought of crossing or following, none of the business surrounding rivers. I knew I would stay with the others until it was time to walk back. For today I had less on my mind than the plovers running back and forth with the waves beyond the green-black water, showing us nothing but the top of her head. Think of her people, I said to myself. Their wisdom and stature. Nearly every stream I ever crossed is looking for this water, and now I'm entering it myself. Sacagawea, bird woman, boat launcher, one of the braided waves, one of the silver ribbons, riding the crest of the waves. This we know for sure. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? Jacqueline and I started going together in the spring of 1997. And in November of that year, I bought a new TV set just so I could tune in to PBS for the latest Ken Burns film, which was called Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Core of Discovery. Besides Jacqueline's music on the soundtrack, I was interested to see some commentary in the film by an old friend from college days, the poet Erica Funkhauser. Erica had been brought into the film because of her long poem, Bird Woman, an imaginative account of Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman who was brought along on the expedition, which I read from earlier. But even if nobody I knew had been involved, the film as a whole was magnificent, with sweeping views of the Missouri River and a fascinating storyline of intercultural exploration. President Clinton was a big fan of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and after the film's release, he invited Ken Burns and much of his crew, including the musicians, to a screening and dinner at the White House, where they got to play for him. The president had brought over from the Smithsonian some of the specimens collected in the original expedition, which had been in government hands ever since. That was 15 years ago, but looking back on it, I have to say it's still kind of thrilling to have your girlfriend invited to play at the White House. I only wish I could have wangled an invitation for myself. But I think back to that fine film as I try to wrap my mind around the Doctrine of Discovery, the subject of a new resolution from the General Assembly in Phoenix. It turns out that the Lewis and Clark expedition was all about claiming territory for the young United States under that doctrine. But before I go there, let me note how the General Assembly came to pass this resolution. The GA had been planned for Phoenix for several years when the state of Arizona enacted its draconian anti-immigration law. We thought about boycotting, but our allies in the fight against the new law said, no, come ahead and protest. We'd rather have you here. So we turned it into a Justice GA. And this resolution was one of the results. We are the second denomination calling for repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery. The Episcopalians did it in 2009. Now, what does it have to do with immigration, you may ask? Well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples says that indigenous people should have the right to their homelands, to free travel within their homelands, even though those may cut across national borders. The national borders came in after they created their homelands. So that's where it ties into immigration. According to the resolution, one of the partner organizations that we were working with suggested that the UUA look into the doctrine for the reason I just said. This resulted in presentations at GA from several speakers, of whom I found the talk by Professor Robert Miller most enlightening. So I bought his book, Native America, Discovered and Conquered, Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark, and Manifest Destiny. Miller is not only a professor at the Lewis and Clark Law School, but he is Chief Justice of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde in Oregon, and himself a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. So he is Native American, a tribal judge, and a law professor. As I see it, the Doctrine of Discovery is kind of a heads we win, tails you lose proposition. It basically says that when a Christian nation discovers territory occupied by non-Christian peoples, the Christian nation has first dibs as against any other Christian nation, a kind of toehold. So it's primarily a way of deciding between two European powers who gets to be sovereign in a particular non-European territory. But it does have an effect on the rights of the indigenous peoples as well, as we shall see. it's good to keep in mind these two aspects of the doctrine, how it works between two or more European powers, and later the United States as a successor to the British interest, and how it works between a European power and the rights of the natives. In a nutshell, the doctrine holds that the Christian power that discovers a place acquires the exclusive right to govern it, and subject to the rights of its natives, to its land. Most importantly, the discovering power has the exclusive right to conclude the native people's rights in the land by conquest or by purchase. The doctrine originates with the decrees of the popes in the 15th century. A papal bull in 1436 titled Romanus Pontifex affirmed Portugal's right to convert the Canary Island natives and to manage and control the islands on behalf of the Pope. As Portugal extended its explorations down the coast of Africa, new papal bulls were issued which gave wider scope to the explorers. One in 1455 allowed Portugal, quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, and placed, end quote, and to place them in perpetual slavery and to take all their property. When we look at this today, we are horrified by the disregard for the rights of the natives it displays, but to other European powers looking at it at the time, the most important thing was that it gave a monopoly franchise to Portugal in the territory that it covered. It was because of this Portuguese monopoly in nearby Africa that Spain decided it had to go west and sent Columbus to look for a western route to the Orient. When Columbus found land in the New World, he claimed his discovery of islands in the Caribbean meant that they were subject to the Spanish monarchs. Those monarchs lost no time in dispatching ambassadors to the Pope to confirm this fact, and in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued 3 bulls confirming that the lands discovered by Columbus would inure to the Spanish crown because they had been undiscovered by others. Spain and Portugal now had conflicting papal decrees, and they were concerned to resolve the conflict. The Pope first drew a north-south line down the middle of the Atlantic and decreed that everything east of the line belonged to Portugal and everything west to Spain. But then Portugal discovered the easternmost tip of South America and negotiated a treaty with Spain that shifted the line westward to allow them to claim that new territory, which is why Brazilians today speak Portuguese instead of Spanish. Then England and France got into the act. Englishman John Cabot had sailed the Atlantic coast of North America in 1496 into 1498, and England claimed this gave them discovery rights to the whole territory. France vigorously contested these English claims. Ultimately, France and England would fight a war over their New World claims in the 18th century. But back in the 16th, Queen Elizabeth I added a crucial test to the doctrine of discovery. In order to have good title to lands, it was necessary for the European power to actually occupy and have possession of it. So the instructions from the English monarchs to their explorers were to discover and colonize lands unknown to all Christians and not actually possessed of any Christian prince. These were the conditions expressed in the first charter to Virginia in 1609 and the charter to the Pilgrims of Massachusetts in 1620. But colonies are expensive and risky compared to explorers. So explorers continued to perform ritual acts when landing on foreign shores. They would hang tokens from the trees or post signs proclaiming their possession. And this continues to the present day. What did Neil Armstrong erect on the moon? American flag. Still, actual occupation made a stronger claim than these symbolic gestures. But if we need to plant colonies, we have to have land to plant them on. How is this land to be acquired? The doctrine of discovery said by sale or conquest of the natives. While there are plenty of instances of simply taking land by force or goading the natives into war, in the main, the English powers, and since the American Revolution, the United States, have taken lands from the Indians by purchase or treaty. Not that the treaties have been kept, but that's another story. But it is galling to think that after the Revolution, the U.S. adopted the rights of Great Britain under the Discovery Doctrine. For as originally framed, these rights inured to Christian nations. The original moral justification for overriding the rights of native peoples was to bring them to the gospel and save their souls, while of course taking their lands and destroying their culture. And yet in the Treaty of Tripoli in 1797, the United States government formally declared that it was not founded on the Christian religion. Nevertheless, the Doctrine of Discovery proved handy for the new nation in dealing with the indigenous peoples within its borders and on its frontiers. Probably the most important part of the Doctrine of Discovery is what is called preemption. Only the discovering government may purchase lands from the natives. Private bargaining and sale are out, as is sale to any other European sovereign. This aspect of the doctrine impacts the history of chattel, for such a provision was enforced in the Plymouth colony in the 17th century, when William Nickerson moved into this area and purchased several tracts of land from the local station, Madaquesa. These sales were deemed void because Nickerson had not obtained the permission of the Plymouth court. It took several years to get the title straightened out, and had it not been straightened out, we might not be celebrating Chattel's 300 this year. But it doesn't take an economic genius to see what an injustice this preemption worked on the natives. It's the old story of monopolies. Monopolies, whether of seller or buyer, can set their own prices, and everyone who deals with them has to pay or accept the price they set. If the natives had been free to sell to the highest bidder, they would have gotten a fairer price for their land. Preemption, this legal monopoly on the purchase of lands from the Indians, was the touchstone of the case where the U.S. Supreme Court recognized the Doctrine of Discovery, Johnson v. McIntosh, in 1823. Before the Revolutionary War, land speculators had bought huge tracts of land in what is now Illinois and Indiana, directly from the Indian tribes at fire sale prices. When the territory was part of the colony of Virginia and had a statute in force pursuant to the Doctrine of Discovery forbidding private purchases from Indian tribes. Once the revolution was concluded, the new government got the idea to carve off that territory and buy lands from the Indians to resell to settlers and thus pay the cost of the revolution. So the new government bought the same lands that the Indians had previously sold to the private parties and resold it to other private parties. What a conundrum. Who owned it? The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the first purchasers took nothing because private sales were against the law at that time. Now, if Native Americans had had complete ownership of the land in the first place, they would have had the freedom to sell to whoever they chose. In other words, who is the United States to come in and tell the Indians what they can do with their land? The court ruled that they did not have this right, and how did they get deprived of it? By their discovery by the Europeans centuries before. They, of course, never invited the Europeans to discover them, and thus they lost a valuable right without their knowledge or consent. After surveying the history, Chief Justice Marshall expressed the rule succinctly, quote, "The United States then has unequivocally acceded to that great and broad rule by which its civilized inhabitants now hold this country. They hold and assert in themselves the title by which it was acquired. They maintained, as all others have maintained, that discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy either by purchase or by conquest, and gave also a right to such degree of sovereignty as the circumstances of the people would allow them to exercise." Okay, so you give the Indians a little bit of sovereignty, subject to the superior right of the conquering power. Justice Marshall felt compelled to announce the rule of discovery as the basis on which the land of the United States had been settled, but he did little to defend it as justice. I think he secretly thought it was a pretty raw deal. In a case a decade later, he actually disparaged the doctrine before applying it to the facts before the court. Quote, "Did these adventurers, by sailing along the coast and occasionally landing on it, acquire for the several governments to whom they belonged or by whom they were commissioned a rightful property in the soil, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a rightful dominion over the numerous peoples who occupied it? Or has nature, or the great creator of all things, conferred these rights over hunters and fishermen on agriculturists and manufacturers?" End quote. However absurd the doctrine may have seemed to Justice Marshall, it has governed the relations between the Indians and the United States ever since. It is still good law. Preemption has been profitable for the U.S. The new country was faced with the problem of how to pay for the debts of the Revolutionary War. A great incentive for the states to ratify the U.S. Constitution in 1787 was that the new federal government would assume these war debts from the states. But how would the federal government pay them? By expanding west of the Appalachians and buying lands from the tribes and reselling it. During the Jefferson administration, the U.S. government typically bought land from the tribes for 25 cents an acre and resold it to white settlers for $1.25 an acre, a 500% markup. It was a great deal for the government. Now let's go back to Lewis and Clark. The Doctrine of Discovery throws new light on their expedition of 1803 to 1805, and that's what Mr. Miller, Professor Miller's book is largely about. Meriwether Lewis was personal secretary to President Jefferson, and Jefferson planned the expedition not just to map the western and northwest territory, but to claim it for the United States. In the Pacific Northwest, an American explorer named Robert Gray had reached the mouth of a major river, which he named the Columbia River, by ship in 1796. Under principles of discovery, the claiming of the mouth of the river gave rise to a claim for the entire watershed of that river. So the whole Oregon territory could potentially be had, but there needed to be actual occupancy to ripen the title. A Scotsman had made it to the Pacific coast through Canada a year after Gray and wrote a book about it, which Jefferson and Lewis both read in 1802. The author urged England to send out colonists, and you can hear Jefferson saying, "Not so fast there." So Jefferson said from the beginning that the expedition should try to make it to the Columbia's mouth. They had this idea that there was something called the Northwest Passage, a water route through the continent. Only months after Lewis and Clark were on their way, the Louisiana Purchase suddenly more or less fell into Jefferson's lap, and that made it clear that the claims of France would not be a factor in Western expansion. Establishing trade with Indian tribes was an important part of the mission, and Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark assembled gift kits to give to the various tribes along the way. There were also special medals minted, with a picture of Jefferson on one side and a pair of clasped hands on the other. A speech was composed by Lewis, which he gave at every meeting with the tribes, letting them know that their Spanish, English, and French fathers were no longer in the picture, and they had a new father and friend in Thomas Jefferson. They gave them a medallion and asked them to turn over any similar tokens from the French and Spanish. They invited them to visit St. Louis and Washington, and some of the chiefs did. This assertion of sovereignty was an important ritual under the Doctrine of Discovery, and for the most part it worked. And an important reason it worked was Sacagawea. It was she who could translate Lewis's words for the tribal leaders, and it was she who, seated in the bow of the boat with her infant son, clearly showed the natives viewing the party as they went through the river that it was not a war party, for women are not invited to war parties in those cultures. Sacagawea as a figure is a bit like the Squantum or Squanto here in our neck of the woods, a Native American who could deal with the two worlds. She was true to herself and true to her tribe, and yet she served as a necessary agent of Jefferson's imperial ambitions. In light of Lewis and Clark's handing out of Jefferson medallions as tokens and agents of that imperial design, the U.S. Mint's decision to honor Sacagawea with a gold coin in 2000 is steeped in irony. The westernmost point of the expedition was the mouth of the Columbia, and they built a fort there, Fort Clatsop. In order to perfect U.S. rights under the Discovery Doctrine, they needed to occupy the fort for the winter, which they did. And to seal the deal, Lewis and Clark drew up a declaration saying that they had stayed there and they claimed the territory of the Columbia for the United States. Well, who were they declaring it to? The natives around who couldn't read. But they had several copies made and distributed to the Indian chiefs of the area with instructions to give a copy to any non-Indians who might happen by. Interestingly, an American sea captain came by about 2 months after Lewis and Clark vacated the fort. He was given a copy of the declaration, and he sailed west with it to China where it was transferred to another ship, which eventually brought it back to Boston only a few weeks after Lewis himself arrived on the East Coast. The Lewis and Clark expedition is fascinating and inspiring because the relations with the whites and natives in that expedition were generally balmy. Sacagawea was not the only Indian to facilitate the success of the expedition, despite the effect it would have of opening up lands for settlement and confining the western tribes in smaller and smaller tracts. Later in the century, many of these tribes would opt for open warfare as the only way to attempt to preserve their way of life. We've only skimmed the surface of this story this morning, but we need to stop and ask what we can make of it. I have but a shaky grasp of what the Doctrine of Discovery is, and however unfair it may be, I don't have a good sense of how to undo it. It is all well and good for the DUA General Assembly to pass a resolution calling for its repudiation or repeal, but how does one go about repealing a doctrine embedded in Supreme Court law, not even in the letter of the Constitution? And if it could be done, what would be the effect of that on land titles in this country? Would it call them all into question? My own little piece of real estate is most of my net worth. Does repeal of this doctrine mean that I owe that to my Native American friends? Are all the UU churches which occupy lands once held by Native Americans prepared to de-accession them? I don't know this, but I suspect the development of Indian gaming in the last 20 years has sprung from a recognition that the tribes have gotten a raw deal from the United States over the years. But awarding a state-sanctioned monopoly in a lucrative business is a very materialistic fix. It does nothing to account for the injury to cultures and the way of life of the tribes. The offense is partly physical, partly economic, but it's also in large part spiritual, I think. I come around to the title of this sermon, which is a line from T.S. Eliot. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? Can there be reconciliation, reparations, restitution to the descendants of the occupiers of this land who, without their knowledge or consent, was suddenly placed under the dominion of people carrying crosses? The resolution passed by the General Assembly calls on the U.S. to adhere to the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a 2008 document with the unfortunate acronym DRIP. I've read this declaration, and it's a helpful guide on what current behavior of the developed nations needs to be curbed. As to how to deal with past injustices, Article 28 of this declaration provides, quote, indigenous peoples have the right to redress by means that can include restitution, or when this is not possible, just, fair, and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, and which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. Unless otherwise freely agreed upon by the peoples concerned, compensation shall take the form of lands, territories, and resources equal in quality, size, and legal status, or of monetary compensation or other appropriate redress. It's very general, but it's a good start, stating basically the principles for legal redress. The details would have to be filled in with the historical details of any particular case. The Doctrine of Discovery. There is much more to say about it. There's not the time to say it. I know this is confusing to you. I would remind, particularly the visitors, that all of my sermons are in booklet form out in the foyer, which you can pick up and take home and argue with and shred at your leisure. But in some, the Doctrine of Discovery is a heads we win, tails you lose kind of policy, which for better or worse has governed, mostly worse, has governed relations with our first peoples for 400 years. So I want to close with the words that the UUA Board of Trustees used in urging the study of this doctrine by the congregation and its repeal by the General Assembly, the why we're studying this. Unitarian Universalists have long been guided by the radical notion that the truth will make us free. But we're not free of the past. Our nation lives a lie, and our people are taught a history based in denial. A theology of mutuality and equality rather than that of privilege and dominance, means challenging ourselves to understand this history. The indigenous peoples of this land were conquered by vicious force, and the land was taken from them. These actions were rationalized with the arrogant notion that the natives were savages and the invaders were civilizing Christians. The first people of this land have contributed much to our national culture, our food, our music, and most notably to our impatience with hierarchy and patriarchy. Unitarian Universalist congregations covenant to affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. This, our seventh principle, has profound theological implications. It calls us to a deeply rooted relationship with all that is, realizing that we belong to this world, and the world does not belong to us. Once we take this stance, we realize that the dominant culture of Europe and North America propagates a fundamentally different orientation, one based on exploiting our planet and using it for immediate gratification. We hear claims that the land is a resource and the people of the land should be employed for productive purposes by enterprising people of privilege and power. More and more people are learning that the worldview of domination is profoundly alienating, estranging us from our essential human nature and from each other. Amen.